Hello, everybody. Welcome to History with Mr. E. Sorry about this filter. I have to use it because of where I'm recording from, a top secret location. Um, and nobody's allowed to see anything in the background, except for the name Monroe County, Kentucky on the map, which, uh, guess what? It's not really Monroe County, Kentucky. It's somewhere deep in the bowels of the earth, underneath the volcano, with Lex Luthor. Anyhow, today we're going to talk about the road to war and how things fell apart for America and were rebuilt in the wake of World War II. First of all, America was still suffering under the Great Depression. We're in dire financial straits. And things were bad. The war is what pulled us out of the Depression because the economy went into a war economy of building, of preparing, of putting the factories back to their full potential, putting the farms back to their full potential to work toward the war effort. But let's get back to the start of why Europe went to war in the first place. First of all, Europe was very dissatisfied with the result of World War I, especially Germany, who had been beat up and charged, what did we say, like $30 billion or some ludicrous amount of money. And it was a killer to the economy, to the people of Europe, and how do they compensate for that? Many of the lines of what's the word? I'm sorry, guys. Many of the borders in Europe had been changed. Many of the countries had been disbanded and recombined with other countries. Places like Czechoslovakia and such had been formed, and they didn't like it. The League of Nations failed to disarm the countries after World War I, like they had promised to put an end to war altogether. Socialism rose, socialistic governments and military dictatorships rose up, and there was a lot of tension between Europe as a whole and Germany. Germany had been saddled with tons of debt, and they had to default on those debts. They couldn't pay them. Italy and Japan were in heavy debt, and they were angry about that because they felt that they suffered because of the war. Extreme nationalism took over in Europe, where every ethnic group wanted their own country. Well, not every single ethnic group, but many of the countries that had been torn apart and had their borders redrawn and lands taken away wanted those lands back. They wanted to be independent nations of their own. They were tired of being ruled by other countries. I mean, Europe had been just a mess of different small kingdoms since time out of mind, since the Roman Empire really fell, and the Holy Roman Empire tried to unify them. It just never worked. Now these countries want their own personality to be able to shine through. And in parts of Europe, a lot of dictators rose up. In the USSR, of course, Joseph Stalin was in control. He took over after Lenin passed away in 1927. He put out a 5-year plan to modernize Russia, to compete with the United States and other countries. He wanted to collectivize agriculture, which meant put all agriculture under the purview of the state. And he took a lot of people out of the factories and out of the cities and out of their jobs and tried to put them on these collectivized farms. 10 million people in Russia, because of this wonderful 5-year plan, died from starvation. Russia was a mess. In Italy, a little guy that I think he was a newspaper editor rose up with his fascist party and crushed all opposition and took his own personal army and marched on Rome. His name was Mussolini. The king in Italy abdicated the throne and said, hey, if you want to deal with this garbage, take it. I don't want it anymore. Germany defaulted on all of their war debts in 1923. And they had just begun to recover financially when the Depression hit. And they went into financial ruin once again. It was tough for Germany. They'd had a hard way to go. They, were basically blamed for World War I, which I suppose you could place blame on them, but they were blamed for World War I and treated badly because of it. And they allowed Adolf Hitler to come to power under the National Socialist German Workers' Party, nicknamed the Nazi Party. They called Hitler Der Führer, which means the leader. Sorry in advance to Miss Bayer for pronunciation issues. And he decided that he wanted to resurrect and build a third empire. When he resurrect the old empire, build a third empire called the Third Reich. He ran a fascist government. Fascist, but not only fascist, where it allowed some free enterprise, but was mostly, everything was controlled by the state. So it was basically a socialist free enterprise that was mostly just run by the state. But he also ran the country with terrorist aggression, which means that he ran the country by scaring people into doing what he wanted, by killing anyone that got in his way. He also lived with the ideas of fanatical racism. He hated Jewish people. He was terrified of other countries' intelligentsia, the smart people that worked in universities and schools and ran factories and taught people. And he didn't just run socialist or fascist government, but he ran an anti-democratic government, a nationalist government. Germany is first and foremost. He was convinced of this fact, and he convinced the German people of an international conspiracy of Jewish bankers, of Western, which means us, mostly capitalists, and communists that were out to conquer Germany. Hitler took control of private businesses. He wrote an autobiography called Mein Kampf. I think that means my prison, but I don't remember what Kampf means for sure, and I apologize again to Kiara for not knowing that. I should probably try to learn a little bit of German. But Mein Kampf wasn't just a book about Hitler's life. And Hitler was a brave soldier. He won the German equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, from what I understand. But not only was Mein Kampf an autobiography, but it was also a book of Nazi philosophy. And then the Nazis started doing things that were scary. They wanted eugenics, to breed the perfect human being. They killed off all terminally ill people. They executed mentally retarded people, physically disabled people, and then they put all the Jewish people that they could first into a giant ghetto, 2-3 families per apartment, no bigger than, a decent-sized living room. And then they put them in concentration camps. And this started in in the 1930s, I guess. It may have started just slightly earlier than the 1930s, but it started mostly in the 1930s. And throughout the 1930s was largely ignored, this, what we call the Holocaust today. It was largely ignored by the other countries of the world for a couple different reasons. I think mostly because they, A, didn't know exactly what was going on, and B, they were scared to death of the little man with the bottle brush nose mustache. Because he killed anyone that got in his way. He burned Parliament at one point. He just ruled through terror. People were afraid to go out in the streets. Not only Jewish people, but the German people, were coerced into joining the Nazi Party or going along with these war efforts. And let's shift our focus to Japan, a largely militaristic society. They needed raw materials for industries. They wanted to expand. They wanted to form an empire. And Japan's just a tiny little string of islands, but they are filled with people. And like I said, it's a militaristic society that thought that they were on a mission from God, and they were fanatical about it. And in my opinion, they began World War II, even before Germany, by invading Manchuria in 1931. And not only did they invade Manchuria, but they raped, pillaged, murdered, and were cruel in Manchuria. They would have contests, line up a bunch of Chinese people in Nanking, have them bend over, and see who could cut the most people's heads off in a minute. I won't even go into the sexual depravities that were visited on people there. And they just destroyed cities. Now, don't get me wrong. I refuse to support any decisions that they made. But at the same time, China had done some pretty atrocious things in the past to Japan. And something that Leo Stumbeck taught me last year was that not only, did Japan bad, the bad guy in the war, but when we got to the island hopping part of World War II, our soldiers did some pretty awful things too. Because it's war and because man has a sinful nature. I won't make excuses. I won't hide from the truth. I mean, nobody was free from guilt in a situation like this. Japan, however, wanted Manchuria for its natural resources and for a military base. Japan conquered and set up the Manchukuo government, and the League of Nations condemned what they'd done in Manchuria, and the U.S. refused to recognize that government, but China was weak. Japan conquered the entire eastern Chinese seaboard, looted, burned, raped, slaughtered all the way through many cities. Nationalist Chinese under, the nationalist Chinese were under a leader called Chiang Kai-shek, but they were already fighting a war against the communist leader Mao Zedong. The U.S. supported China. We sent the Flying Tigers over there, volunteer airmen, to fight on China's behalf, but it just was too little, too late. In Ethiopia, Mussolini had promised Italy that he was going to rebuild the Roman Empire, and the first thing he did was go after Ethiopia. Their brave king, Haile Selassie, was overtaken by Mussolini, and though they fought bravely, they were not a nation that could stand up to that kind of attack. And they did not get any support from the League of Nations because nobody wanted to fight a war in Europe, and the League of Nations was weak. And so Ethiopia fell to Mussolini. Spain was fighting a civil war, and Francisco Franco was their leader. He was supported by Germany and Italy and had to fight Russian communists from taking over Spain for years. And he became their leader and stayed their leader for many, many years. One of the main things that they fought over were fighting over before World War II started was the Rhineland. In 1935, Germany began a draft for all men in Germany and built their army up to 600,000 men, built an air force, built a submarine navy, and they filled the Rhineland with troops. This was all against the wishes or against the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. So it was obvious that Germany was doing a major military and industrial buildup. But what could Europe do? In 1936, Germany recognized Italy's claim to Ethiopia and joined with Italy and Japan in signing the Anti-Comintern Pact to oppose communism, which is funny because they were all socialists, and they formed the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis in 1940. They called it the Axis powers, and they said that the world would turn on an axis between Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo. So all of a sudden there's a major military alliance with these massive powers. Hitler publicly stated that Germany didn't want to annex Austria, and then he supported the Austrian Nazi Party. And in 1938, he sent troops in and annexed the entire party without firing a shot. So he did it by political means and then massive military buildup. Czechoslovakia, a country that had become prosperous after World War I, it's where a lot of my relatives are from. 3.5 million Germans in the Sudetenland who were pro-Hitler and pro-Nazi were living within Czechoslovakian borders in the Sudetenland. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, which was traditionally German in his eyes, be returned to Germany. So the French Prime Minister, WWII, and the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went to Munich to negotiate with Hitler about this. But they didn't invite the Czechoslovakian representatives. And they formed the Munich Pact. And in September 29th of 1938, they dismembered Czechoslovakia, gave the Sudetenland back to Germany, and Neville Chamberlain declared that they had peace in our time, that they had rebuilt peace in Germany and in Europe, But all they really did was forestall the war by a few months. And Hitler behaved for a little while, but then by March 1939, so September 29th, so October, November, December, January, February, less than 6 months, Hitler marched on Czechoslovakia and took the whole country under his control. So now we have the Axis, who owns Japan, Italy, Germany, Ethiopia, the entire eastern Chinese seaboard. They took Czechoslovakia and Austria, and they're just consolidating massive amounts of power. Mussolini seized Albania in 1939. And this next move is what started the war. Hitler demanded something called the Polish Corridor. He demanded Danzig, also known as Gdansk, and he fortified something called the Siegfried Line, which was a massive fortification in Eastern Europe to oppose the French fortifications called the Maginot Line. So all of a sudden, we have massive lines of fortification in Europe. Hitler's consolidating power all across Europe with Italy in tow. You know, there was Hitler. He was a short guy, but he was a giant of a political leader, followed around by his little toady Mussolini. And then Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with Russia. We're not going to fight against you. And then on September 1st, 1939, Hitler marched on Poland. The French and the British delivered an ultimatum to Germany. They demanded withdrawal from Poland. Germany refused, and war was declared on September 3rd, 1939. And we'll talk about the European theater from 39 to 41 next lesson.